Imagine for a moment that the most powerful weapon ever created wasn't a sword, a spear, or a siege engine. It was a story. A story so deeply woven into the fabric of a culture that it could convince thousands to march into battle, to build monuments that scraped the sky, to surrender their freedom for a divine cause. Across the vast tapestry of human history, from the sun-baked banks of the Nile to the cloud-shrouded temples of the Andes, ancient civilizations mastered this incredible art. They didn't just tell tales around the fire, they engineered mythic origin stories with the precision of modern propaganda machines, using them to justify expansion, cement control, and shape the destiny of nations. These narratives were far more than simple folklore or religious belief. They were carefully crafted instruments of power, designed to legitimize the rule of kings and emperors by connecting them directly to the gods. Imagine being told that your leader wasn't just a man, but the living incarnation of a deity, chosen by cosmic forces to lead your people to glory. That belief could turn conquest into a sacred duty, making the unthinkable seem inevitable and right. It unified diverse populations under a single banner, suppressed dissent before it could even form, and created a shared identity that stretched across continents and generations. The psychological impact was profound, tapping into our deepest needs for belonging, purpose, and meaning. In this video, we're going to unravel exactly how these ancient origin myths were constructed, disseminated, and weaponized. We'll travel through time and across cultures, exploring how the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Rome, and the rulers of the Aztec Empire all used strikingly similar narrative strategies to expand their domains and maintain their grip on power. But this isn't just a history lesson, it's a key to understanding the world we live in today. Because the same storytelling techniques that built ancient empires are still at work all around us, shaping our beliefs, our politics, and our very sense of reality. So join us as we journey into the heart of these powerful legends and discover why recognizing the patterns of mythic manipulation matters now more than ever. Think of a mythic origin story as the ultimate founding document of an ancient civilization, far grander than any simple historical record. These were not just tales told for entertainment around a fire. They were the very bedrock of a society's identity, a carefully constructed narrative that explained who they were, where they came from, and most importantly, why they were special. At their core, these stories masterfully wove together threads of real, perhaps half-remembered history with the golden thread of the supernatural. A great flood, a wandering tribe, a fierce battle. These historical kernels were transformed. They became events directed by the hands of gods, starring ancestors who were not merely human but demigods or chosen prophets. This blending was intentional, designed to create an unshakable sense of destiny and divine favor. It told every member of that culture that their existence was not an accident of history, but a purposeful act of cosmic will. This sense of a preordained purpose served several powerful functions. First and foremost, it provided an ironclad identity. In a world of countless tribes and emerging nations, your origin story set you apart. It answered the fundamental question of, who are we? With a resounding and glorious answer, we are the children of the sun god, or we are the people guided by a wolf to our promised land. This shared narrative created an instant, powerful bond between individuals who might have never met, uniting them under a single banner of belief. Furthermore, these stories provided a moral compass. They didn't just say where you came from, they prescribed how you should live. The actions of the gods and heroes in these tales established laws, social roles, and cultural values, reinforcing the existing social hierarchy. They explained why the king ruled, why the priests interpreted the will of the gods, and why the farmers worked the land. It was all part of the divine order established at the dawn of time. For the rulers of these ancient states, this narrative power was the most valuable tool in their arsenal, far more efficient than mere military might. A soldier can enforce obedience in a town square, but a story can enforce loyalty in the human heart. By claiming a direct lineage from a deity or a legendary founder, a leader could justify their authority absolutely. Their right to rule was not up for debate because it was not granted by the people. It was inherited from the gods. This divine mandate was the ultimate political trump card. It transformed expansionist ambitions from acts of greedy aggression into sacred duties. Conquest wasn't about stealing land and resources. It was about fulfilling a prophecy, reclaiming a divine inheritance, or spreading the light of civilization to those living in darkness. This psychological reframing was genius. It made the act of conquest seem not just acceptable to the conquering people, but inevitable and even righteous. This taps into something profoundly deep within human psychology. We are storytelling creatures hardwired to seek meaning, belonging, and purpose. A powerful origin story satisfies all these needs at once. It gives people a place in a grand, cosmic narrative, making them feel part of something larger than themselves. This sense of belonging is so potent that it can override individual doubt or fear. When a soldier believes he is fighting for a God-ordained cause, his morale and resilience are vastly improved. When a farmer believes his taxes support a divine king who maintains the balance of the universe, he pays them with a sense of duty rather than resentment. By fulfilling these deep-seated needs, mythic origin stories became the invisible architecture of ancient power, allowing empires to build, expand, and sustain themselves not just on force, but on a foundation of widely accepted belief. Understanding how these stories were structured and the functions they served is the first key to unlocking the secrets of ancient dominance, revealing how the pen, or the chisel carving the first epic into stone, was indeed mightier than the sword. To grasp how these ancient tales could command such influence, we need to understand the very architecture of the human mind. Our brains are not simply cold, logical processors of information. They are fundamentally wired for narrative. From the earliest campfires to the modern cinema screen, we are captivated by stories because they engage us on a deeply emotional level, forging connections that raw data or lists of facts could never achieve. A story can simplify a staggeringly complex idea, like the founding of a nation or the nature of the cosmos, into a relatable sequence of events with heroes, challenges, and triumphs. This process transforms abstract concepts into something tangible and memorable, something that can be easily passed down through generations. More importantly, a powerful shared story creates a collective identity, a sense of we that transcends the individual. It tells everyone within earshot that they are part of a single community with a common past and a shared destiny, a psychological bond far stronger than any decree from a distant palace. Ancient rulers, though they lacked our modern understanding of neuroscience, were master intuitors of this psychological reality. They recognized that a well-told origin myth was a far more effective tool for governance than a standing army alone. You could station soldiers in every village to ensure compliance through fear, but that is incredibly costly and breeds simmering resentment. A compelling story, however, could foster genuine collective loyalty and dramatically diminish resistance by reframing the entire concept of conquest. An invasion wasn't presented as a brutal land grab. It was a sacred duty, a cosmic necessity to bring order to chaos or to fulfill a prophecy told by the gods themselves. This narrative shift was psychologically brilliant. It allowed a soldier to see himself not as an aggressor but as a pious instrument of divine will. and it encouraged conquered peoples to see their submission not as a defeat but as joining a grand, preordained historical trajectory. The genius of these myths lay in their use of universal archetypes, fundamental character types, and story patterns that resonate across different cultures and eras. The chosen hero, born under special circumstances and destined for greatness, the divine mandate, a command from a higher power that cannot be questioned, the promised land, a fertile territory waiting for its rightful people to claim it. These archetypes are instantly recognizable and emotionally persuasive because they tap into our deepest hopes and fears. A person hearing such a story, whether in Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica, would intuitively understand its symbolic language. This cross-cultural adaptability made these myths incredibly potent tools for empire building, as the same core narrative could be slightly adjusted to fit local customs while maintaining its central message of inevitability and rightful domination. By embedding societal values, norms, and laws within these thrilling tales of creation and destiny, myths became the primary vehicle for social conditioning. The story itself became the teacher. It wasn't a dry list of rules stating, "Obey the king." It was an epic where the king's ancestor, blessed by the gods, led the people to salvation, thereby proving why his bloodline must always rule. This ensured compliance through a sense of awe, wonder, and belonging rather than through fear alone. The psychological leverage this provided was immeasurable. It allowed sprawling empires with their limited communication and administrative resources to maintain a cohesive culture and a stable grip on power across thousands of miles. A handful of priests reciting a sacred text in a temple could achieve what would otherwise require thousands of tax collectors and soldiers. This proved a timeless truth of human history, that a deeply held belief, skillfully cultivated, could be a force more potent than any army. Nowhere was this psychological power more brilliantly harnessed than in the sun-drenched civilization of ancient Egypt, where the entire state was engineered around a single, breathtaking claim that the ruler was not just a man, but a living god walking the earth. The pharaoh's identity was a masterful piece of political theology, a seamless fusion of human and divine that began the moment he took the throne. He was hailed as the earthly incarnation of Horus, the fierce falcon-headed god of kingship. This was far more than a lofty title. It was the very core of Egyptian political reality. The myth of Horus's epic struggle against his uncle Set, the god of chaos and disorder, was not just an entertaining legend. It was a continuous, unfolding drama where every pharaoh played the lead role. His entire reign was framed as an eternal reenactment of this cosmic battle, a sacred duty to maintain order over the ever-lurking forces of chaos. This narrative provided a powerful, all-encompassing explanation for everything from the annual flooding of the Nile to the need for military campaigns. This divine status was rooted in an even more profound origin story, the Heliopolitan creation myth. In this account, the world began with a vast, dark, and endless ocean of nothingness called None. From these primordial waters, a mound of earth emerged, and upon it, the sun god Atum-Ra willed himself into existence. The myth then describes how Atum-Ra created the first divine couple, Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, who in turn gave birth to Geb and Nut, earth and sky. Their offspring were the famous gods Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. The crucial link to the pharaoh comes through Osiris, the first mythical king of Egypt, who was murdered by his brother Set and then avenged by his son Horus. Every single pharaoh was believed to be the latest manifestation of Horus while alive, and upon his death, he would become Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, to be succeeded by a new Horus, his son. This created an unbreakable cycle of divine rebirth and legitimacy. One particularly vivid version even describes the first pharaoh emerging from the primordial waters atop a radiant lotus flower, a direct physical connection between the monarchy and the moment of creation itself. This wasn't ancient history. It was a living, breathing reality that positioned the pharaoh as the indispensable linchpin holding the entire ordered universe together. To make this abstract belief utterly inescapable, the Egyptians built their theology into the very landscape. Monumental architecture served as the ultimate propaganda, physical proof of the pharaoh's divine power and eternal right to rule. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were colossal resurrection machines and potent symbols of the pharaoh's role as the apex of human society, the point where the earthly world connected with the divine. The immense temples at Karnak and Luxor, with their forest of towering columns and colossal statues, were not mere places of worship. They were the dwellings of the gods on earth, and since the pharaoh was the chief priest and a god himself, these spaces reinforced his supreme authority every single day. Walls were covered in intricate reliefs depicting the pharaoh in the company of gods, often being touched by them or even suckled by a goddess, scenes that visually hammered home his otherworldly nature. For an ordinary Egyptian farmer living in a mud-brick house, these stone mountains of impossible scale were a constant, overwhelming reminder that their ruler was a supernatural force, far beyond question or challenge. This divine framework also perfectly justified military expansion and control. Conquests were never portrayed in art or inscriptions as brutal acts of aggression for land or wealth. Instead, they were always depicted as the sacred restoration of Maat, the fundamental concept of cosmic order, truth, and justice. The pharaoh was shown in classic smiting scenes, his arm raised to strike a cowering foreign chieftain, but this violence was framed as a necessary act. The enemies were not other human beings with their own legitimate claims. They were forces of Isfid chaos and falsehood that threatened the stability of the entire cosmos. By subduing them, the pharaoh was performing his most vital duty, protecting Egypt and all of creation from a return to the primordial chaos that existed before Atum-Ra. This narrative gave Egyptian soldiers a righteous cause and offered a potent ideological tool for assimilating conquered peoples. Submission to the pharaoh wasn't defeat. It was joining the side of cosmic order and being brought into the light of civilization. This brilliant fusion of myth and raw political power created one of the most stable and enduring systems of control the world has ever seen. A civilization that thrived for over 3,000 years by ensuring that every subject, from the highest priest to the lowest laborer, truly believed in the God who ruled them. While the pharaohs built their divine legitimacy on millennia-old traditions, the Romans took a decidedly more pragmatic approach to myth-making, engineering their own epic origin story at a pivotal moment to cement a new era of power. Enter Virgil's Aeneid, a literary masterpiece that was, at its heart, one of history's most brilliant pieces of state-sponsored propaganda. Commissioned by Emperor Augustus, this epic poem was designed with a very clear political objective: to give Rome a foundational myth that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the revered Homeric tales of Greece, while simultaneously legitimizing Augustus's new regime and its vast imperial ambitions. Before the Aeneid, Rome's origins were relatively humble and somewhat murky, involving tales of Romulus and Remus being raised by a she-wolf. Augustus understood that to rule a sprawling, diverse empire, he needed a grander narrative, a story that wove his own family into the very fabric of the cosmos. Virgil's solution was both ingenious and audacious. He reached across the Mediterranean to the most famous conflict in Greek legend, the Trojan War, and claimed a piece of it for Rome. The poem tells the saga of Aeneas, a Trojan prince and son of the goddess Venus, who escapes the burning city of Troy carrying his elderly father on his back. His long, arduous journey, buffeted by storms and the wrath of the goddess Juno, is not merely a random exile but a divinely guided mission. Jupiter himself proclaims that Aeneas is destined to found a new city in Italy, a city from which will spring a race destined to rule the world. This was a breathtaking rhetorical move. It gave Rome a heroic pedigree that predated and arguably surpassed that of the Greeks, while also framing the entire history of Roman expansion not as a series of aggressive wars, but as the slow, inevitable unfolding of a prophecy made by the king of the gods. The poem is saturated with visions of this glorious future. In the underworld, Aeneas's father shows him a pageant of future Roman heroes, all the way up to Augustus, who is prophesied to usher in a new golden age of peace and global dominion. These literary devices were not subtle. They were a direct argument to the Roman people and the world. Every conquest, from the hills of Gaul to the deserts of Egypt, could now be understood as part of this divine plan to civilize the world under Roman law. The brutal reality of legions crushing resistance and enslaving populations was thus softened, wrapped in a noble, even pious veneer. The Roman soldier was no longer just a man fighting for pay or glory. He was an agent of fate, fulfilling a cosmic mandate that began with a refugee from Troy. But a story, no matter how well told, is useless if no one hears it. Augustus and his administration ensured the Aeneid was not confined to the scrolls of the elite. It became a central text recited in public forums and taught in schools, making its narrative the official version of Roman origins. The myth was further embedded into daily life through sheer saturation. Coinage minted with the image of Aeneas carrying his father spread the iconography across the empire. Elaborate public festivals and triumphal processions reenacted scenes from the epic, visually connecting the current emperor to the legendary hero and the goddess Venus. This multi-pronged propaganda campaign ensured that both Roman citizens and conquered peoples were constantly reminded of this sacred destiny. For a subject in a distant province, seeing the face of Augustus on a coin next to the figure of Aeneas was a powerful, everyday reinforcement of the idea that Roman rule was ancient, godly, and unchangeable. This strategic narrative achieved something remarkable. It aligned raw imperial ambition with a perceived cosmic order, transforming the history of a powerful city-state into a sacred saga with a preordained conclusion. By claiming a divine mandate for conquest, Rome could justify its dominance over countless diverse cultures, from the Celts to the Egyptians, presenting assimilation into the empire not as a loss of freedom, but as an invitation to join the most important story ever told. The Aeneid provided a shared identity and a sense of higher purpose that helped hold the vast empire together for centuries, proving that a well-crafted story could be as vital to maintaining power as the sharpest gladius or the sturdiest wall. Far to the south, in the high-altitude basin of what is now Mexico, another civilization wielded a myth of destiny with equally potent force, but with a far more visceral and urgent cosmic stakes. The Aztec narrative was not one of serene, eternal order like Egypt's, but of a desperate, cyclical struggle that required constant feeding through human sacrifice. Their entire identity as a people was forged in the crucible of a seemingly endless migration, a journey they believed was personally directed by their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, the fierce god of the sun and war. According to their foundational legend, they originated from a mythical place called Aztlan, which translates to the place of whiteness or the place of herons. They were not a powerful people at the start. They were humble migrants, often scorned and forced to live on the margins of more established city-states in the Valley of Mexico. This underdog beginning made their eventual rise to power all the more dramatic and, in their eyes, all the more proof of their divine selection. Huitzilopochtli was more than just a god to them, he was a literal guide. Through the voice of his priests who interpreted his will, he gave the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, direct instructions on where to travel. The god promised them a sign, a vision so specific it could not be mistaken. They would know they had reached their promised land when they saw an eagle perched proudly on a cactus, with a snake clutched in its talons. This was not a vague omen but a precise image, one that would eventually become the central symbol on the modern Mexican flag. For generations, they searched, enduring hardships and serving as mercenaries for more powerful kingdoms, all the while waiting for their divine moment. When they finally arrived at a swampy, seemingly undesirable set of islands in Lake Texcoco, the prophecy was fulfilled. There, on a small island, they witnessed the eagle, the cactus, and the snake. They had found the site of their destined city, Tenochtitlan. This myth provided an unassailable justification for their presence. They weren't squatters on another group's territory. They were fulfilling a cosmic real estate contract signed by their god. Their right to that land was, in their view, absolute and divinely ordained. But the myth didn't stop with mere settlement. It provided the ideological engine for their entire imperial project. The narrative held that Huitzilopochtli was born ready for battle, springing from his mother Coatlicue fully armed to defend her honor, and he required a specific nourishment to maintain his strength, sacred water, or in more literal terms, human blood. As the god of the sun, his daily battle across the sky was a perpetual war against the forces of darkness and chaos. To lose strength was to risk the sun not rising, plunging the world into eternal night and ending the current cycle of existence. This created a terrifying and non-negotiable urgency. The Aztec state had a sacred duty to provide this vital sustenance, this precious water, or divine liquid, which translated into the practice of large-scale human sacrifice, particularly the offering of captured warriors' hearts to the sun god. Conquest, therefore, was framed not as a quest for wealth or territory alone, but as a necessary religious undertaking to gather the sacred fuel that kept the universe running. This belief system created a self-perpetuating cycle of warfare known as the Flowery Wars. These were not always fought for immediate territorial gain, but were often ritualized battles arranged with rival city-states like Tlaxcala for the express purpose of capturing prisoners for sacrifice. For an Aztec warrior, going to war was the highest form of piety. Dying in battle or being sacrificed was not an end but a glorious transition, a way to join the solar god in his daily struggle. The myth provided immense motivation, turning soldiers into fervent believers who fought with incredible bravery to secure captives for the altars of Tenochtitlan. Conversely, for their rivals and subject peoples, this narrative was a tool of psychological intimidation. The Aztecs were not just a powerful enemy, they were the instruments of an insatiable god, and resistance was not just futile but potentially blasphemous, an attempt to starve the sun itself. The elite perpetuated this story through every available medium. Priests recited the migration epic during grand public ceremonies. Scribes painted vivid codices depicting the eagle and the cactus prophecy alongside scenes of Huitzilopochtli's divine birth. The most powerful performance of all was the sacrifice itself, a public spectacle held atop towering pyramids like the Templo Mayor, which was dedicated to both Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. The entire city would witness the captured warriors, their hearts offered to the sun and their bodies ritualistically treated, a gruesome but effective display of divine power that cemented the authority of the ruling class and reminded everyone of the cosmic necessity of Aztec dominance. This was the ultimate blend of spirituality and imperialism, where faith justified force and empire building was presented as the only way to save the world from annihilation. What's truly fascinating is that when we step back and examine these diverse stories from Egypt, Rome, and the Aztecs, clear and powerful patterns begin to emerge. It's as if ancient rulers from every corner of the globe were reading from the same hidden playbook on how to use narrative to seize and hold power. Three themes in particular surface again and again, proving to be incredibly effective tools for justifying expansion. The first is the concept of a divine mandate. This is the idea that a ruler isn't acting on their own human ambition, but is instead carrying out the direct orders of a god or a pantheon of gods. Their wars are not their wars, they are the wars of the deities. This brilliantly absolves the leader of any personal responsibility for the bloodshed and suffering of conquest. It's not greed or a thirst for power motivating them, it's piety. A pharaoh conquering Nubia or an Aztec emperor launching a flowery war could both claim they were simply performing their sacred duty, a necessary act to please their gods and maintain the very fabric of reality itself. The second recurring theme is the powerful notion of a chosen people. This narrative insists that one particular group is special, set apart from all others by divine favor. They might be the children of a specific god, like the Aztecs with Huitzilopochtli, or the descendants of a legendary hero blessed by the gods, like the Romans tracing their line back to Aeneid and Venus. This creates an immediate in-group and out-group dynamic, fostering a strong sense of unity and superiority within the culture while simultaneously devaluing everyone outside of it. If your people are uniquely chosen for greatness, then the land you wish to inhabit isn't really someone else's home. It's your divine inheritance waiting for you to claim it. The people already living there become obstacles to a cosmic plan rather than rightful inhabitants, making their displacement or subjugation seem not only acceptable but necessary. This idea taps into a deep psychological need for belonging and significance, making individuals proud to be part of a grand, preordained story. The third powerful motif is the belief in predestined victory. This is the ultimate psychological weapon, designed to boost the confidence of the conquerors and crush the spirit of those who would resist. The message is simple and terrifying for any opponent. The outcome is already decided by forces far greater than any army. The gods have willed it, the prophecies have foretold it, and the very stars have aligned to make it so. For the soldiers marching into battle, this belief is a potent tonic against fear. They fight with the unshakable confidence that they are on the winning side of history, that their cause is blessed, and that even death might serve a higher purpose. For the people standing in their path, this narrative can be utterly demoralizing. Why fight a doomed battle against fate itself? This idea of inevitability is a masterstroke of psychological warfare, often making conquest cheaper and faster by encouraging surrender rather than prolonged, bloody resistance. Together, these three themes, divine mandate, chosen people, and predestined victory, form a devastatingly effective moral framework. They perform a kind of ethical alchemy, transforming naked aggression into a form of sacred piety. Conquest is no longer a sin, it's a virtue. Taking land and resources isn't theft, it's the fulfillment of a celestial contract. This framework systematically dismantles potential ethical objections before they can even be raised, both within the conquering society and among the conquered. It's a strategy for manufacturing consent on a massive scale, making expansion feel not just justified but obligatory. And while we see this pattern clearly in the ancient world, its echoes reverberate throughout history, right up to the modern era. The 19th century American doctrine of manifest destiny, which justified westward expansion across North America at the expense of native peoples, leaned on these exact same ideas: a divine mandate to spread civilization, the notion of a chosen people, and an inevitable victory that was their preordained right. By recognizing these ancient narrative strategies, we gain a critical lens through which to examine not only the past but also the stories that powerful entities tell us today to justify their own ambitions. But these powerful myths didn't write themselves or spread by chance. They were meticulously crafted and relentlessly disseminated by a specialized class of intellectual elites, priests, bards, and scribes who acted as the master architects and amplifiers of state-sanctioned narratives. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent of a combined ministry of information and public relations firm. working in close collaboration with rulers to weave political agendas into the very fabric of religious belief and cultural identity. Their primary task was to carefully tailor these foundational stories, ensuring they consistently supported the ruling dynasty's claim to power while systematically suppressing any competing or alternative versions that might challenge the official line. In Egypt, this collaboration was exemplified by the immensely powerful priesthood of Amun. Based at the great temple complex of Karnak, these priests weren't just isolated holy men. They were savvy political operators and wealthy landowners who formed a crucial partnership with the pharaoh. When a pharaoh returned from a successful military campaign, it was the priests of Amun who would integrate his victories into the sacred texts and temple inscriptions, framing them not as mere territorial gains, but as the pharaoh fulfilling his cosmic duty to defeat the forces of chaos. In return for this vital propaganda service, the pharaohs showered the temple with lavish gifts of land, gold, and booty, making the priesthood of Amun one of the wealthiest and most influential institutions in the kingdom. This symbiotic relationship ensured that the narrative of the pharaoh's divinity remained unchallenged for centuries. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans employed a different but equally effective group of narrative guardians, the augurs and other state priests. An augur's job was to interpret the will of the gods by reading signs in the flight patterns of birds, the appearance of sacrificial animals, or even the pattern of lightning in the sky. This practice, known as taking the auspices, was a crucial step before any major state undertaking, especially a military campaign. A consul leading an army would never march to war without an augur declaring that the gods favored the endeavor. The brilliant and highly manipulable aspect of this system was that the signs were often ambiguous, allowing the augurs, who were themselves members of the elite senatorial class, to interpret them in a way that supported the state's current political or military goals. A failed campaign could be explained away as a misinterpretation of a sign or a failure to properly appease the gods, thus protecting the core narrative of Rome's divine favor even in the face of defeat. These intellectual elites were handsomely rewarded for their services, enjoying privileged status, tax exemptions, and significant political influence. In exchange, they used every tool at their disposal to embed the official myths into the daily rhythm of life. Grand public festivals, like the Roman Ludi or the Egyptian Opet Festival, were not just entertainment. They were massive, state-funded spectacles that dramatized the foundational stories for huge crowds. Bards and poets would recite epic tales of heroic ancestors in public squares, while scribes meticulously copied approved texts in scriptoriums, ensuring that only the official version of history was preserved and distributed. This control over the means of communication and education was absolute. In an era before mass literacy, those who controlled the stories controlled reality itself. They dominated the cultural memory, consciously marginalizing dissenting voices and local traditions that might undermine the central authority. This created a formidable propaganda machine, a seamless collaboration between spiritual and temporal power. The ruler provided the political will and the material resources, while the priests and storytellers provided the ideological justification and the means of dissemination. It was a partnership that proved incredibly durable, allowing empires to project power, maintain social order, and command loyalty across vast distances and diverse populations for centuries on end. The true power of a myth wasn't just in its telling, but in its relentless, multifaceted repetition by a dedicated class of believers who knew that the story was the ultimate key to stability and control. Yet for all their permanence, these stone narratives were not the only tools in the ancient propagandist's kit. The true genius of their strategy lay in how they scaled these grand ideas down, weaving mythic symbolism into the very fabric of daily existence. Beyond the pyramids and temples, the ideology of divine kingship was stamped onto the coins that jingled in every merchant's purse, carved into the signet rings that sealed official documents, and woven into the textiles worn during public ceremonies. The Roman eagle, the aquila, was not merely a symbol, it was the soul of a legion. To lose the aquila standard in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a sign that the unit had lost the favor of Jupiter himself. Similarly, the Egyptian ankh, symbolizing life and the divine breath of the gods, was ubiquitous. It appeared on temple walls, was held in the hands of pharaohs in statues, and was even used as a common amulet, a constant, subtle reminder that the gift of life itself flowed through the ruler who was the god's representative on earth. This saturation of symbolism meant that a citizen could not go about their day without encountering multiple reinforcements of the state-sanctioned myth, making the extraordinary idea of a god-king feel ordinary, natural, and unquestionable. This pervasive visual language served a crucial psychological function. It made the abstract tangible and the debatable undeniable. An average farmer who might never set foot inside the inner sanctum of a vast temple complex would still handle a coin bearing the emperor's profile, subtly linking the ruler's authority to the economic transactions of daily survival. A soldier would look upon the legion standard, seeing not just a metal bird but a promise of divine support and a focal point for his loyalty. In Mesoamerica, the elaborate headdresses and jade regalia worn by Maya kings during public ceremonies transformed a man into a living embodiment of the world tree, a conduit between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. The spectacle was the message. By experiencing the myth through multiple senses, sight, sound, and even touch, the population internalized the narrative on a subconscious level. It became less a story to be believed and more a reality to be lived, an accepted part of the world's natural order. This embedding into the collective psyche was the ultimate goal, creating a culture where obedience was not born of fear alone, but of a deeply ingrained awe and a sense of belonging to a preordained divine structure. The strategic placement of these monuments was equally calculated for maximum impact. They were not hidden away but erected along busy processional routes, in central plazas, and at visually dominant high points, ensuring they were unavoidable features of the civic landscape. The sheer scale and permanence of stone sent an unambiguous message of power intended to dwarf the individual viewer, both physically and psychologically. A person standing at the base of a Mayan pyramid, craning their neck to see the ruler performing rituals at the summit, was meant to feel small and insignificant in comparison to the king who communed with the gods. A Roman citizen walking through a triumphal arch was literally passing through a monument that celebrated imperial conquest and the favor of the gods, a visceral experience of the state's power. These structures were designed to be experienced collectively during public festivals and rituals, forging a shared identity and a common memory among the populace. The monument became the backdrop for the community's most important moments, further intertwining the myth of the state with the personal lives of its people. By studying these artifacts and structures, we are essentially decoding the original blueprints of mass persuasion. Every chisel mark on a stela, every curve of a hieroglyph, and every strategic alignment of a pyramid to a celestial body was a deliberate choice to reinforce a specific worldview, one that placed a divinely sanctioned ruler at the center of the universe. They are a testament to the understanding that to control a people, one must first control their imagination. These stone and symbol narratives were weaponized to create a reality so immersive and so visually overwhelming that alternative viewpoints became unimaginable. They forged a pervasive culture of obedience not through constant coercion, but by constructing an awe-inspiring reality where compliance felt like participation in something eternal and sacred. The silent, enduring stones thus speak volumes, telling us a story of how myth was made material, and how that material was then used to build empires that were meant to last forever. This fusion of divine myth and earthly law represents one of the most sophisticated and enduring applications of narrative power in the ancient world. It wasn't enough for rulers to simply command obedience through force. They sought to embed their authority into the very moral and legal consciousness of their people, making disobedience feel not just illegal, but fundamentally unnatural and sacrilegious. By anchoring their legal systems in a divine origin story, they elevated human-made decrees to the level of cosmic principle, placing them beyond question or debate. This strategy transformed the law from a set of practical rules for societal function into a sacred covenant between the people, their ruler, and the gods themselves. The most iconic example of this principle is undoubtedly the famed law code of Hammurabi, king of Babylon. This extensive set of laws, inscribed on a towering black diorite stele, is preceded by a breathtaking piece of political and religious theater. At the top of the stone, Hammurabi is depicted not as a mighty warrior or a stern judge, but as a humble supplicant. He stands before the enthroned sun god Shamash, the deity of justice, who is handing the king the symbols of royal authority. The accompanying text makes the message explicit. It was the gods Anu and Enlil who called Hammurabi to establish righteousness in the land, and it was Shamash himself who provided the laws. This visual and textual narrative was a masterstroke. It presented the code not as Hammurabi's personal creation, but as a direct revelation from the divine realm. Every law, from those governing commerce to those prescribing punishments for assault, was thus imbued with a sacred quality. To break one of these laws was not merely to offend the king or the state. It was to commit an act of impiety, a sin that disrupted the divine order and risked bringing cosmic retribution down upon the entire community. A similar, though geographically distant, parallel can be found in the Andes Mountains with the Inca Empire. The Sopa Inca, the emperor, was believed to be the direct son of Inti, the all-powerful sun god. This wasn't a metaphorical title, it was a literal tenet of faith that formed the bedrock of Inca law and society. As the child of the sun, the Sopa Inca was an infallible living god whose word was law. His decrees, known as Wilak Umu, were considered divinely inspired pronouncements. There was no concept of a separate, secular legal code that could be debated or amended by a council of elders. The law was whatever the god-king said it was, because his very nature connected him to the fundamental order of the universe. This belief granted his commands an absolute authority that was virtually unassailable. To question a tax levy or a conscription order was not just sedition, it was blasphemy against the sun itself. This divine justification allowed the Inca state to orchestrate massive public works projects, like the breathtaking terraces and road systems, and to demand the mita labor tax from millions of subjects, all under the unimpeachable logic that they were serving the son of the god who provided light, warmth, and life to the world. This intertwining of myth and law created a uniquely powerful deterrent against rebellion or dissent. A potential challenger to the throne had to consider more than just the strength of the royal army. They had to grapple with the terrifying prospect of opposing the will of the gods. Would the sun still rise if they overthrew its son? Would the rivers still flow if they defied the commandments given to Hammurabi by Shamash? This psychological barrier was often more formidable than any physical one. It forced any opposition to first wage a war of ideas against the very foundation of the state's religious beliefs, a nearly impossible task in a world where those beliefs were reinforced daily by priests, monuments, and public rituals. The legal system, therefore, became self-policing on a spiritual level. Citizens were encouraged to comply not only out of fear of the royal guard, but out of a genuine desire to maintain cosmic harmony and avoid divine displeasure that could manifest as drought, famine, or plague. Ultimately, this strategy allowed rulers to frame governance itself as the highest form of sacred duty. They were not mere administrators or powerful warlords. They were the stewards of a divine plan, the mediators between the human and the heavenly. This perspective justified not only their right to rule but also their use of harsh and seemingly arbitrary measures. A brutal punishment could be explained as a necessary sacrifice to appease an angry god, and a sweeping decree that uprooted communities could be presented as the fulfillment of a celestial blueprint. By weaving myth so thoroughly into the fabric of law and justice, ancient elites constructed a system of control that was remarkably resilient, deeply internalized by the population, and incredibly effective at maintaining social order for generations. It was the ultimate convergence of story and power, where the pen of the myth-maker proved mightier than the sword of the warrior. This sophisticated strategy of mythic absorption represents a fascinating and often overlooked dimension of ancient statecraft, where the most successful conquerors understood that a heavy-handed imposition of foreign gods could breed resentment and rebellion. Instead of simply erasing the beliefs of the people they subdued, they practiced a form of spiritual diplomacy, weaving local deities and legends into the fabric of their own state-sanctioned narratives. This approach was far more cunning than outright destruction. It was a deliberate effort to make conquest feel less like a hostile takeover and more like a reunification or a homecoming, softening the blow of foreign domination and giving subdued cultures a stake in the new imperial project. By acknowledging and even adopting the gods of others, these empires presented a facade of inclusivity and respect, effectively lowering the psychological barriers to their rule and fostering a surprising degree of loyalty among their new subjects. The Romans were the undisputed masters of this technique, turning religious syncretism into a fine art that served as a cornerstone of their imperial policy. As their legions marched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they encountered a dizzying array of local pantheons. Rather than demanding that every conquered people abandon their ancestral gods to worship Jupiter and Mars, Roman officials and priests would work to identify parallels. They sought out shared attributes and domains, creating a divine equivalency chart that facilitated cultural fusion. The Celtic god of healing and springs, for instance, was merged with their own Apollo to become Apollo Granus. The fierce Germanic goddess of the hunt was aligned with Diana, while the powerful Egyptian mother goddess Isis was welcomed into the Roman religious fold with her own dedicated cults that spread all the way to London. This process, known as Interpretatio Romana, was a brilliant political maneuver. It allowed a Gaulish warrior to continue honoring his local deity, but now within a framework that also acknowledged the overarching authority of the Roman state and its celestial patrons. This spiritual flexibility made the Roman Empire feel less like an outside force and more like a big tent under which many traditions could comfortably coexist, as long as ultimate allegiance was paid to Rome. Perhaps no ancient figure better exemplifies the personal application of this strategy than Alexander the Great. A master of symbolic politics, Alexander recognized that to rule the vast and ancient empire of Persia, he could not simply be seen as a Macedonian invader. After conquering Egypt, he made a pivotal journey to the remote oasis temple of Siwa to consult the famous oracle of Ammon, a god the Greeks equated with their own Zeus. The oracle's proclamation, which reportedly hailed Alexander as the son of Ammon Zeus, was a propaganda coup of immense proportions. In one stroke, he transformed his identity for his new Egyptian subjects. He was no longer a foreign conqueror. He was literally the son of their chief deity, a legitimate pharaoh in the tradition of the gods. He later applied this same principle in Persia, adopting elements of Persian court dress and ceremony to present himself not as a destroyer of their culture, but as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings, a ruler who respected and embodied their traditions. This careful curation of his divine lineage across cultures was a key factor in holding his fractious and diverse empire together, demonstrating a keen understanding that legitimacy is often a matter of perception and narrative. However, this apparent inclusiveness always had its limits and was executed with meticulous calculation. The goal was never to create a truly equal multicultural society, but to facilitate control and ensure the unchallenged supremacy of the conqueror's core narrative. Local gods might be adopted, but they were almost always subsumed within the hierarchy of the dominant pantheon. A local war god might be welcomed, but he would be identified as a regional aspect of Mars, implicitly acknowledging the superiority of the Roman original. The fascinating story of the Trojan hero Aeneid, so central to Rome's own origin myth, was itself a form of co-option, appropriating the legendary history of a conquered Greek civilization to bolster Rome's prestige. This process required careful manipulation to ensure that the original, empowering meanings of local myths were subtly reshaped to support the imperial agenda. A goddess of fertility might be retconned into a supporter of the emperor's divine right to rule, or a creation myth might be tweaked to suggest that the conquering people had always been destined to arrive. This demonstrated the incredible flexibility and cunning behind mythic propaganda. It showed that the most durable power doesn't just crush opposition, it cleverly disarms it by offering a place within its story, all the while ensuring that the pen holding that story never leaves the conqueror's hand. Yet for all their imposing grandeur and psychological reach, these state-sponsored myths were never quite as monolithic or unchallenged as the empires themselves might have wished. Even under the most repressive regimes, in the shadow of the most towering pyramids or the most lavish temples, subjugated peoples found ways to preserve their own stories, to whisper counter-narratives that defiantly questioned the legitimacy of their conquerors. These alternative tales became vital tools of cultural resistance, secret reservoirs of identity and hope that allowed communities to maintain a sense of self and a vision of a different future, even under the heel of foreign domination. They represent the other side of the coin of mythic power, the enduring human refusal to have their story entirely written for them. One of the most powerful and enduring examples of this phenomenon is the Jewish narrative of Exodus. For centuries, the pharaohs of Egypt had propagated a mythic framework that presented their rule as an extension of divine will, a necessary force for maintaining cosmic order against the chaos represented by foreign peoples. The Exodus story, preserved and passed down through generations of Hebrew slaves and their descendants, directly turned this official narrative on its head. In this counter-story, the Egyptian state is not the guardian of divine order but the embodiment of oppressive, immoral tyranny. The pharaoh is not a living god but a stubborn, cruel monarch whose heart is hardened against the demands of justice. The escape of the Israelites, guided by their deity, is framed not as an act of rebellion against a legitimate ruler, but as a divine liberation from an evil system. This was a profound act of narrative resistance. It took the core claim of Egyptian propaganda, the divine mandate of the pharaoh, and systematically dismantled it, asserting instead that true divinity sided with the oppressed, not the oppressor. This story provided a powerful source of identity and hope for a people living under imperial control, assuring them that their suffering was seen and that their liberation was part of a higher moral plan. A similar pattern of counter-storytelling emerged across the Atlantic in the wake of European conquest in the Americas. While Spanish chroniclers and priests were busy creating narratives that framed their arrival as a glorious, godly mission to save savage souls, indigenous communities were preserving very different accounts. In many of these native myths, the conquerors were not portrayed as radiant saviors or divine agents, but as invaders, tricksters, or even monstrous beings. Some Mesoamerican stories recast the Spanish conquest as a temporary, cyclical downturn in the age of the world, a period of darkness that would eventually be corrected by the return of indigenous gods or heroes. This wasn't just a refusal to accept defeat. It was a sophisticated narrative strategy to deny the conquerors the ultimate victory, the victory of controlling the historical and cosmological story. By casting the Spanish as tricksters, a common archetype in many Native American mythologies, these stories diminished their stature. A trickster is not a noble god or a destined ruler. He is a chaotic, self-serving figure who wins through deceit, not virtue or divine right. This reframing robbed the conquest of its supposed moral and spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of the conquered, allowing them to process the catastrophe without accepting the conqueror's version of reality. These dissenting narratives, often shared in secret gatherings, encoded in art, or woven into seemingly innocuous folk tales, served several crucial functions for subjugated peoples. Primarily, they were a mechanism for preserving cultural identity. When an empire imposes its language, its religion, and its history, holding onto your own stories becomes an act of defiance. These counter-narratives kept alive a community's memory of who they were before conquest, their values, their heroes, and their connection to their land and gods. Furthermore, they provided a framework for hope and resilience. A story that predicts the eventual return of a hero or the downfall of an unjust ruler is a powerful psychological tool for enduring hardship. It transforms present suffering into a temporary trial on the path to a promised future. Perhaps most importantly, these alternative voices created a space for moral judgment. They allowed the oppressed to assert that what was happening to them was not right, not justified, and not the will of the true gods, directly challenging the moral foundation of the conqueror's myth. Studying these resistant stories is essential because it reveals the inherent limitations of even the most powerful propaganda machines. It shows that the human desire for autonomy, truth, and self-determination is incredibly resilient. No amount of monumental architecture or state-sponsored ceremony could completely stamp out the whispered stories that circulated in slave quarters, remote villages, and family homes. These counter-narratives remind us that history is never just a single story told by the victors. It is also a multitude of stories preserved by the resilient, a testament to the fact that the control of belief is always a contested battlefield. The very existence of these dissenting voices across cultures and millennia highlights a universal truth, that people will always find a way to tell their own story, to assert their own dignity, and to keep alive the hope for a different ending, even when all other forms of power have been taken from them. Perhaps the greatest misconception about these ancient stories is that they were fixed, immutable scriptures carved in stone for all time. In reality, they were living, breathing instruments of statecraft, constantly being rewritten, edited, and sometimes entirely reinvented to serve the political needs of the moment. A change in dynasty, a new foreign threat, or an internal power struggle could all trigger a dramatic revision of the official narrative. This remarkable plasticity was not a sign of weakness but a source of incredible resilience, allowing ancient states to adapt their foundational myths to maintain control and legitimacy amidst a constantly shifting world. The stories themselves became barometers, sensitive to the slightest changes in the political atmosphere, and by tracking their evolution, we can read the hidden history of power struggles, ideological battles, and desperate bids for control that often escape the traditional historical record. One of the most dramatic and abrupt examples of this phenomenon unfolded in 14th century B.C. Egypt under the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. For over a millennium, Egyptian society had been perfectly structured around a sprawling pantheon of gods, with the sun god Amun-Ra at its apex and a powerful, wealthy priesthood to manage his worship. Akhenaten, however, executed a religious revolution so radical it shook the empire to its core. He declared the sun disk, known as the Aten, to be the one true God, a singular deity whose life-giving rays sustained all creation. He abandoned the traditional capital of Thebes with its entrenched priesthood of Ammon and built an entirely new city dedicated to the Aten. In this new theology, Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, were not just intermediaries to the god, they were the sole conduit through which the common people could access the divine. This was a breathtaking power grab, an attempt to dismantle the influential and politically meddlesome Ammon priesthood and centralize all religious, and therefore political authority directly in the hands of the pharaoh. The myth of the state was completely rewritten almost overnight to serve a new political vision of absolute, unmediated royal power. Yet this revolution also demonstrates the limits of top-down narrative control when it runs too far ahead of popular belief and institutional inertia. Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment was profoundly unpopular. It alienated the powerful priestly class, confused the general populace who were now forbidden from worshipping their familiar household gods, and neglected foreign policy as the pharaoh focused on his theological project. Upon his death, the traditional power structure struck back with a vengeance. His successors, most notably Tutankhamun, systematically dismantled his legacy. They reopened the old temples, restored the vast pantheon of gods, and erased Akhenaten's name from official king lists, effectively trying to scrub him from history. The myth was forcibly returned to its previous form, not out of a sincere spiritual rediscovery, but as a pragmatic political strategy to restore stability, placate the powerful priesthood, and reunify a fractured kingdom. The entire episode reveals myth not as sacred truth, but as a tool, one that could be picked up, wielded for a specific purpose, and just as quickly discarded when it no longer served the needs of the state. Centuries later and a continent away, a similar narrative upheaval was occurring in the Roman Empire, though with a vastly different outcome. By the early 4th century A.D., the empire was straining under internal crises and external pressures. The old pagan myths, centered on Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, had served Rome well for centuries, but they were increasingly failing to provide a unifying spiritual framework for an immensely diverse population. Emperor Constantine the Great, a master strategist, recognized the rising influence and organizational power of Christianity, a once persecuted faith. Following his famous vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which he interpreted as a sign from the Christian God, Constantine legalized the religion and began to actively support it. This was not necessarily a sudden conversion of personal faith, but a brilliant political calculation. He saw in Christianity's monotheistic structure a perfect model for imperial unity, one God in heaven mirrored by one emperor on earth. The Christian narrative of a kingdom not of this world could be adeptly repurposed to support a very earthly empire, encouraging obedience to authority and offering a universal message that could transcend the old regional pagan loyalties. Constantine and his successors then embarked on a process of careful synthesis, blending Christian themes with traditional Roman symbols of power. The Chi-Rho symbol, representing Christ, began to appear on Roman military standards and imperial coinage. The architecture of the Roman Basilica, a secular hall of justice, was adapted for Christian worship, creating a sense of familiar authority. Church councils, like the Council of Nicaea, were organized and overseen by the emperor himself, positioning him as the head of the faith and the arbiter of theological orthodoxy. In this way, the Roman state didn't just adopt a new religion, it absorbed it, co-opting its narrative and organizational strength to prop up the faltering imperial project. The myth was reinvented for a new era, transforming the empire from a pagan power into a Christian one, all in a calculated effort to maintain political control and social cohesion. This strategic plasticity ensured that the idea of Rome would endure long after the Western Empire's political collapse, living on through the institution of the Church. While the stories of Egypt, Rome, and the Aztecs are compelling on their own, their true significance emerges when we place them side by side with tales from distant cultures. It's a breathtaking realization that empires separated by vast oceans and millennia, with no possible contact, somehow arrived at the same narrative blueprint for power. This isn't a coincidence. It points to a profound universal truth about human psychology and the fundamental mechanics of building and maintaining an empire. The strategies of mythic justification were discovered and perfected independently across the globe, suggesting they tap into something deeply ingrained in our species, a shared toolkit for turning ambition into accepted destiny. Consider the philosophical framework that governed Chinese emperors for over 3,000 years, the mandate of heaven. This was not a static claim of divine birthright, but a dynamic and conditional contract between the ruler and the cosmos. The emperor, the son of heaven, was granted the right to rule only as long as he governed with virtue, compassion, and effectiveness. His mandate was visible in the prosperity of the people, the harmony of the seasons, and the stability of the realm. Natural disasters, famines, or widespread rebellion were interpreted not as simple misfortunes but as clear signs that the emperor had lost the favor of heaven, that his virtue had decayed, and that his mandate had been withdrawn. This created a powerful and self-renewing justification for both rule and rebellion. A new dynasty, rising to overthrow a corrupt one, could claim it was not committing treason but was instead heaven's chosen instrument for restoring balance. This is a direct parallel to the Roman ideal of the emperor ruling with the favor of Jupiter, but with a crucial, pragmatic twist. The mandate of heaven provided a built-in cosmic-level justification for regime change. It made political revolution a part of the natural, divine order, a concept that allowed Chinese civilization to endure through countless dynastic transitions while maintaining a continuous cultural identity. On the Indian subcontinent, a different but equally powerful concept emerged, the Chakravartin, or the universal monarch. This ideal ruler was not just a conqueror but a righteous wheel-turner, a king whose spiritual and moral perfection was so immense that it set in motion a wheel of destiny that would roll across the world, bringing all other kingdoms peacefully into his harmonious orbit. The Chakravartin's conquests were not depicted as bloody campaigns of subjugation, but as a benevolent, almost magnetic force of dharma, cosmic law, and order. His very presence was so virtuous that other rulers would naturally submit, recognizing the superiority of his reign and wishing to participate in the peace and prosperity he embodied. This mirrors the Mesoamerican belief in cyclical eras of creation and destruction, where a new world age required a new dominant power to uphold the cosmos. Both concepts, the Indian Chakravartin and the Aztec fifth sun, frame expansion as a cosmic necessity, a duty that transcends mere human ambition. The parallel is stunning, a concept from the philosophical traditions of India and a belief from the ritualistic civilizations of the Americas. Both arrived at the same conclusion that true, legitimate conquest is not about subjugation for its own sake, but about assuming a burden for maintaining the universe itself. What these astonishing parallels reveal is that the use of myth as a tool of control is a universal phenomenon, a strategic innovation that emerged independently wherever human societies grew large enough to become empires. This points to common psychological underpinnings. Every human community, regardless of its location or era, grapples with the same fundamental questions. Why should we obey this leader? Why is it right for us to rule over others? Myths provide the answer by connecting the present to a grand, cosmic context. They satisfy our deep-seated need for meaning and belonging, offering individuals a valued role in a story much larger than themselves. For a soldier in a Roman legion, a peasant in Han China, or a warrior in Tenochtitlan, believing that their actions were part of a divine plan, gave their sacrifices purpose and made the immense social hierarchies of ancient life feel natural and justified. This cross-cultural analysis does more than just highlight interesting similarities. It provides us with a master key to understanding how power operates on a global and historical scale. It shows that the specific gods and heroes may change, but the underlying narrative structures are remarkably consistent. By recognizing these patterns, the conditional mandate, the universal monarch, the cosmic duty, we gain the ability to look past the exotic surface details of any ancient culture and see the common gears of propaganda turning beneath. This understanding is crucial because these ancient patterns never truly vanished. They simply evolved, putting on new clothes to walk the modern stage, continuing to shape the stories nations tell themselves to justify their place in the world. Yet this incredible power to inspire and unify carried within it a terrifying potential for darkness, a capacity to sanctify horrific violence and systemic oppression by cloaking them in the unquestionable authority of the divine. The same narrative mechanisms that could bind a society together could also be deliberately weaponized to dehumanize outsiders, reframe brutal conquest as pious duty, and suppress any flicker of empathy or critical thought that might question the official story. This represents the most disturbing application of mythic storytelling, where the very stories that gave people meaning and purpose were twisted into instruments of unimaginable suffering, all while convincing the perpetrators they were acting as agents of a higher good. We see this tragic paradox reach its most extreme expression in the practice of Aztec mass sacrifice, a system of ritualized violence that was sustained by a powerful and terrifying cosmological narrative. As we discussed, the Aztec universe was perceived as incredibly fragile, existing in a perpetual state of balance that depended on a constant offering of life force to the gods. The sun god Huitzilopochtli required nourishment, the precious liquid of human hearts, to win his daily battle against the forces of darkness and ensure the sun would rise again. This was not presented as a choice or a preference. It was framed as a non-negotiable cosmic necessity. The staggering scale of this practice, with some accounts describing sacrifices numbering in the thousands during major ceremonies, was therefore normalized not as bloodlust but as the ultimate act of collective responsibility. A priest performing the act of extraction was not a murderer. He was a vital technician sustaining the universe. A warrior capturing enemies for the altar was not a brutal aggressor but a pious provider. The victims, often prisoners of war from rival states, were systematically dehumanized within this narrative framework. They were referred to as the literal embodiments of the gods themselves in a sacred role play, their violent deaths a necessary and even honorable participation in the cycle of life and death that kept the world turning. This mythic logic created a moral blind spot so vast it allowed for the routine, industrialized taking of life on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, all while the society saw itself not as monstrous but as devout and dutiful. This strategy of dehumanization through divine narrative was not unique to the Americas. Half a world away, the formidable Assyrian Empire of the ancient Near East perfected a different but equally effective form of mythic propaganda to enable its relentless expansion. The Assyrian kings presented themselves as the chosen instruments of their chief god, Ashur, and their military campaigns were meticulously depicted not as quests for plunder and territory, but as acts of divine vengeance against those who had offended the god's majesty. The elaborate stone reliefs that adorned their palace walls at Nimrud and Nineveh are chilling in their detail. They don't just show battles, they show the gruesome aftermath. Piles of severed heads, impaled bodies, and conquered rulers being led with hooks in their noses or forced into cages. Accompanying inscriptions boast of flaying rebels alive, burning cities to the ground, and sowing the earth with salt. Crucially, this graphic violence is always framed within a religious context. The king is shown standing devoutly before Asher, receiving his commands. The atrocities are not acts of random cruelty, but the execution of a divine sentence. This narrative served a dual psychological purpose. For the Assyrian soldiers, it granted a form of moral immunity, encouraging them to commit acts of extreme violence without the burden of guilt. They were merely the wrathful hand of Asher delivering justified punishment. For their enemies, the widespread dissemination of these reliefs and the stories they told was a weapon of psychological warfare, designed to terrorize populations into immediate submission. Resistance was not just futile, it was blasphemous, and the horrifying consequences were set in stone for all to see. This dark aspect of myth reveals a profound and enduring ethical danger, one that transcends ancient history. When a society fully embraces a mythic framework where its actions are divinely mandated, it creates a context where the ends are always seen to justify any means. Critical thought becomes heresy. Empathy for the designated other becomes a weakness. Questioning the narrative is tantamount to siding with chaos and evil. This suspension of individual moral judgment in favor of collective belief is the engine that has driven history's greatest atrocities, from the Crusades and witch hunts of the medieval period to the genocidal ideologies of the 20th century. In each case, a powerful story was constructed that designated a specific group as less than human, as a threat to a sacred order, or as an obstacle to a predestined future, thereby legitimizing their persecution or eradication. Recognizing this ancient pattern is not merely an academic exercise, it is a crucial tool for cultivating modern vigilance. The specific gods and rituals may have changed, but the underlying mechanics of narrative manipulation remain eerily familiar. Modern political and ideological movements often employ the same tactics, crafting stories that exploit deep-seated emotions and group identities to justify hostility, discrimination, or violence against outsiders, immigrants, or rival nations. These narratives are often framed in terms of a sacred duty to protect a way of life, a divine mandate to spread a political ideology, or a historical destiny that justifies preemptive action. By understanding how ancient myths were used to sanctify the unsanctifiable, we gain a critical lens to examine the stories we are told today. It allows us to ask the essential questions: who benefits from this narrative? Who is being dehumanized within its logic? And what actions is it designed to make us accept as normal or even righteous? This historical awareness underscores a timeless need to champion critical thinking, to question emotional appeals that demand the suspension of empathy, and to constantly guard against the seductive power of stories that promise glory and purity at the expense of our common humanity. Beyond the battlefields and the grand temples, the true engine of every ancient empire was economics, the relentless need to control land, labor, and resources to feed the state, fund its armies, and display its glory. But convincing people to hand over their grain, their livestock, and their labor was a constant challenge. This is where myth performed one of its most pragmatic and ingenious functions, weaving a sacred justification around the very act of economic extraction. These stories didn't just explain where a people came from, they explicitly laid out who owned what and why, transforming taxes from a simple obligation into a pious offering and resource control from an act of greed into a divine privilege. The Inca Empire provides a breathtakingly comprehensive example of this principle in action. At the heart of their economic system was a powerful and non-negotiable belief. The Sopa Inca, as the direct son of Inti, the sun god, was the literal owner of everything in the empire. This wasn't a metaphorical claim to ultimate authority. It was understood as a literal, factual reality. Every potato field on a mountainside terrace, every llama herd grazing in the high plains, every mine rich with gold and silver, and even the labor of every single subject belonged to the emperor by divine right. This mythic framework created the perfect ideological conditions for a completely state-controlled economy. Since everything was already his, the Sapa Inca could generously allow his people to use portions of land for their own subsistence, but the state retained the ultimate right to claim any and all surplus. This system of mandatory labor service, known as the mita, required every household to contribute a certain number of days each year to work on state projects. This wasn't seen as oppressive forced labor. It was presented as a sacred duty owed to the god king, a necessary contribution to the maintenance of the empire that the sun god had willed into existence. People would build roads, weave textiles for the army, or work on monumental construction projects not under the lash of a taskmaster, but with a sense of participating in a divinely ordained system of reciprocity. The state provided security, organized food storage for famines, and hosted great festivals, and in return, the people offered their labor as their sacred share. This mythically enforced economic model allowed the Inca to mobilize massive workforces without cash or markets, building an infrastructure of roads and storehouses that became the backbone of their imperial power. A similar pattern, though with a different cultural flavor, emerged millennia earlier in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. Here, city-states like Ur and Babylon were utterly dependent on the complex irrigation systems that channeled water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to their fields. Controlling this water was a matter of life and death, and the kings who managed it needed an unassailable claim to authority. They found it in myth. Sumerian and Akkadian creation stories often depicted the gods themselves as the original organizers of the universe, vanquishing primordial chaos to establish order. The king was positioned as the god's chief administrator on earth, his primary duty being to continue this work of imposing order on the human world. The most visible and vital manifestation of this order was agriculture, and its foundation was irrigation. Therefore, the digging and maintenance of canals were not mere public works projects. They were sacred acts that mirrored the creative deeds of the gods. A king who commissioned a new canal was not just improving infrastructure, he was fulfilling his divine mandate, acting as a faithful steward of the gifts given by the gods. This narrative provided the perfect justification for taxation. The bountiful harvests that resulted from these God-sanctioned irrigation projects were not solely the property of the farmer who grew them. A portion, often a substantial one, belonged to the temple and the palace because they were the institutions through which the god's will was enacted. The famous Code of Hammurabi is steeped in this logic, with laws governing everything from agricultural rents to the liability for poorly maintained irrigation ditches. To withhold this share was not just to cheat the king, it was to steal from the gods themselves, an act of impiety that could bring divine retribution in the form of drought or famine upon the entire community. This mythic link between divine order, royal authority, and agricultural surplus allowed Mesopotamian rulers to amass enormous wealth in their temple granaries, which in turn funded their armies, their bureaucracies, and their monumental building projects, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of economic and spiritual power. This deep integration of story and economics reveals the truly holistic nature of ancient propaganda. It wasn't enough to simply control what people believed about the past. It was essential to control how they understood their present material reality. A farmer tilling his field or a shepherd tending his flock needed to see the hand of the state and the gods in his daily work. By framing resource extraction as a divine right or a necessary sacrifice for cosmic stability, ancient elites ensured that their spiritual authority directly translated into tangible material wealth. The stories they told justified why one class enjoyed vast luxury while others toiled, why the state could demand a portion of every harvest, and why the king's ownership of the land was absolute. This economic dimension of myth was perhaps its most brilliant and enduring application, building empires not just in the mind, but in the very soil, the stone, and the sweat of their subjects. Moving from the economic foundations of empire to the social structures that upheld them, we find that myth was also a powerful tool for organizing and justifying gender roles, often casting women in narratives that served the state's expansionist goals. In the grand epics and foundation stories used to legitimize conquest, female figures were rarely presented as complex individuals with their own agency. Instead, they were most often deployed as potent symbols, their bodies and stories becoming a metaphorical landscape upon which the dramas of male power and territorial control were acted out. They came to represent abstract concepts crucial to the state, the fertility of the land itself, the virtue of the people that must be defended, or the prize of territory that awaited conquest and assimilation. This symbolic use was not a minor detail. It was a central strategy for naturalizing the often violent processes of empire building, making them feel like a natural, even romantic, part of the human and cosmic order. The founding myth of Rome provides one of the most stark and revealing examples of this dynamic. According to legend, after Romulus founded the city, he faced a critical problem. His community was a fledgling settlement filled with men outcasts, exiles, and adventurers, with no women to ensure its future. The solution, as the story goes, was as brutal as it was calculated. Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine people to a grand festival. Once the Sabine men were distracted, the Roman men rushed in and seized their daughters, carrying them off to become their wives. This event, known historically as the rape of the Sabine women, is a foundational story of abduction and forced assimilation. But the Roman narrative doesn't end there. It performs a remarkable act of mythological alchemy. The story continues that the Sabine men, enraged, eventually returned with an army to reclaim their women. At the climax of the ensuing battle, the Sabine women themselves rushed onto the battlefield, but not to choose sides. They pleaded for peace, placing themselves between their Roman husbands and their Sabine fathers and brothers. They argued that they had now built new lives and families in Rome, and that further bloodshed would only make them widows and orphans. This concluding act transforms the entire narrative. A story that begins with a violent crime is repackaged as a tale of necessity that ultimately leads to a higher harmony. The abduction is justified as a desperate measure required for the survival of the new state. The women's intervention is framed not as a condemnation of their captors, but as an endorsement of the new social order. They become the symbolic glue that binds two warring peoples into one united Roman nation. In this way, a myth about mass abduction was used to legitimize Rome's future policy of assimilating conquered peoples, suggesting that initial violence could be washed away by the eventual creation of a peaceful, blended society. The women are reduced to objects whose primary function is to facilitate this political and demographic union, their trauma erased by a narrative that prioritizes the birth and unity of the state above all else. Yet the ancient world was not a monolith in its portrayal of feminine power. If some myths reduced women to passive symbols, others channeled female energy into a fearsome force for conquest and state power through the formidable figures of warrior goddesses. These deities provided a crucial source of divine feminine approval for military campaigns, allowing empires to claim that their aggression was blessed by both masculine and feminine principles. In Greece, Athena was worshipped not only as the goddess of wisdom and crafts, but also as a master strategist and a fierce patron of warriors. She was Athena Primachos Athena who fights on the front line. Heroes like Odysseus relied on her cunning, and the city of Athens itself, an imperial power, placed itself under her protection, seeing its naval campaigns as an extension of her will. Her presence in the Greek pantheon meant that warfare could be framed as intelligent, disciplined, and righteous, a civilized pursuit guided by a female deity, which morally elevated it above mere brute aggression. Similarly, in Egypt, the goddess Isis was a figure of immense and multifaceted power. While she is best known as a devoted wife and mother, her mythology is also steeped in themes of sovereignty and magical dominance. She was revered as the throne itself, the literal seat of power from which the pharaoh derived his authority. Through her cunning and powerful magic, she restored her husband Osiris to life and protected her son Horus, ensuring the survival of the divine lineage that justified the pharaoh's rule. In her role as protector of the state and the dynastic line, Isis was invoked to bless military campaigns and safeguard the empire. The message was clear: the fierce, protective, and magical power of the feminine was fully enlisted in the project of Egyptian conquest and control. A pharaoh going to war could claim the support of a mother goddess fighting to defend her divine child's inheritance. These contrasting archetypes, the passive symbol and the powerful patron, served the same ultimate purpose: reinforcing a patriarchal structure where male authority and aggression were naturalized and legitimized. The stories of captured women like the Sabines created a framework where women were seen as possessions to be controlled, their bodies serving as conduits for political alliances and the reproduction of the citizen body. Their value was tied to their roles as wives and mothers within a system defined by men. Conversely, the warrior goddesses like Athena and Isis were exceptional figures, whose power was often depicted as supportive of male heroes or rulers. Their fierceness was sanctioned because it served the patriarchal state, protecting the king or guiding the male warrior to victory. They were not models for everyday female behavior, but rather divine exceptions that reinforced the rule. By presenting these limited and symbolic roles as natural and divinely ordained, myths effectively baked gender hierarchies into the very foundation of cultural identity. They taught men and women alike that this unequal distribution of power was not a human construct but a reflection of the eternal order of the gods, making it incredibly difficult to question or challenge from within. This deep narrative conditioning ensured that the social engine of the empire, much like its economic one, would run smoothly with everyone regardless of gender, knowing their prescribed place in the story of conquest. The battlefield, long before the first spear was thrown, was a psychological arena where victory was often won not by strength of arms alone, but by the power of story. Ancient commanders were master psychologists who understood that a soldier's spirit was the most critical weapon in their arsenal, and they wielded myth like a general's baton to conduct the emotions of their men. Imagine the scene on the eve of a great clash. Instead of a dry briefing on tactics, the air would be filled with the resonant voice of a bard or a priest, recounting the glorious deeds of legendary heroes from whom the soldiers claimed descent. In Greece, a hoplite phalanx would be reminded that they were the children of Heracles, their very bloodline imbued with a legacy of overcoming impossible labors and monstrous foes. A Roman legionary was told he marched in the footsteps of Aeneid, whose divine mother Venus watched over them, ensuring their fated victory was preordained. This was far more than simple encouragement. It was a profound identity shift. The terrified farmer holding a shield was transformed, in his own mind, into the latest incarnation of an epic hero, fighting not for a patch of dirt, but for eternal glory and the approval of the gods. This narrative alchemy turned fear into fervor, making men capable of astonishing feats of bravery they would never have attempted for a paycheck or out of mere duty. This manipulation of morale extended beyond grand stories into the very interpretation of the present moment through the lens of divine will. The taking of auspices, reading the flight patterns of birds, examining the entrails of a sacrificed animal, was a standard practice for armies like the Romans. While it appeared to be a humble inquiry of the gods, it was often a brilliantly stage-managed piece of theater, a favorable omen, whether genuinely believed or conveniently interpreted, could electrify an army with the unshakable confidence that the deities themselves had blessed their cause. Conversely, an inauspicious sign could be used by a shrewd general to delay a battle he knew was ill-advised, all while maintaining the unwavering faith of his troops in the overall divine plan. Homeric epithets, those poetic phrases like swift-footed Achilles or ox-eyed Hera, were more than literary flourishes. They were recited like mantras, compact packets of mythic power that connected the soldier to a timeless world of heroism and divine intervention. This constant invocation of mythic framework gave soldiers a cognitive shield against the chaos and horror of combat, allowing them to see their individual struggle as part of a much larger, nobler, and divinely sanctioned narrative. Yet the very same stories that could inspire such fervent loyalty in one army were deftly repurposed to sow paralyzing fear and doubt in the hearts of their enemies. Psychological warfare through narrative was a refined art. Conquerors understood that the most cost-effective victory was one achieved without fighting at all, and nothing induced surrender faster than the belief that resistance was not just futile, but a direct defiance of the gods. Armies would actively cultivate a mythos of invincibility, ensuring tales of their relentless victories and divine favor spread like wildfire ahead of their advance. The Assyrians were particularly terrifying masters of this, using grand stone reliefs and proclaimed annals that depicted their kings not merely as conquerors, but as the wrathful instruments of the god Ashur, meting out horrific, divine punishment to those who dared oppose them. The message was clear: to fight back was not to fight a human army, but to challenge a cosmic force, and the consequences would be apocalyptic. A more subtle but equally effective approach was the propaganda of mercy, best exemplified by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. As his empire expanded, he faced the constant challenge of securing newly conquered territories without being stretched thin by garrisoning every single city. His solution was a strategic narrative. Cyrus actively circulated stories portraying him not as a brutal subjugator, but as a liberator and a respectful, merciful ruler. He allowed conquered peoples to retain their local customs and religions, often positioning himself as the restorer of their traditional gods who had been neglected by their previous rulers. This narrative was a powerful psychological tool. When a city heard of Cyrus's approach, they were not faced with the simple binary choice of fight or be destroyed. They were offered a third, far more palatable option: yield peacefully and be incorporated into a benevolent empire that would honor your ways. This myth of the merciful king drastically reduced the costs of conquest for Cyrus, convincing many cities to open their gates without a fight, believing they were making a pragmatic choice for survival under a tolerable, even improved administration. This brilliant use of narrative demonstrates the dual-edged nature of myth in warfare. It could be the flaming sword that energized a soldier's heart, or the silver tongue that convinced an enemy to lay down their arms, proving that the most powerful siege engine was often a well-told story. But winning an empire on the battlefield was only half the challenge. The true test of any ancient power was what came next: the immense task of governing a sprawling, patchwork realm of diverse cultures, languages, and loyalties. This is where the subtle, long-term power of myth truly shone, moving from a weapon of war to a tool of administration and integration. The most successful empires understood that you could not hold territory forever through fear alone. You had to give people a reason to want to be part of your system. A shared story, one that offered a new, compelling identity, became the most effective glue for binding these disparate populations together, transforming conquered subjects into willing stakeholders in the imperial project. This process of myth-driven assimilation was a masterstroke of political engineering. drastically reducing the need for costly military garrisons and constant suppression by making the empire's narrative feel like the people's own. The Roman approach to this challenge remains one of history's most sophisticated examples. Their policy was not to erase the cultures they conquered, but to elegantly absorb them, and the myth of Aeneid provided the perfect ideological blueprint for this inclusivity. Remember, Aeneid was not a native Italian. He was a refugee from Troy, a foreign prince who arrived on those shores and married the local Latin princess Lavinia. His very story was one of cultural fusion, establishing a precedent that Rome's strength lay in its ability to incorporate outsiders. This foundational myth directly informed real-world policy. Rome famously extended citizenship to conquered peoples across Italy and later throughout the Mediterranean, a revolutionary concept in the ancient world. More brilliantly, they practiced interpretatio Romana, identifying local deities with their own gods. A Celtic god of healing became associated with Apollo, a Germanic mother goddess with Diana. This wasn't just tolerance, it was a strategic invitation. It allowed a Gaulish warrior to continue honoring his ancestral spirits, but now within a framework that also acknowledged Jupiter's ultimate authority. By giving local elites a path to Roman citizenship and incorporating their gods into the vast imperial pantheon, Rome offered a compelling bargain. Retain your local identity and even gain new privileges, but do so within the overarching story of Rome's multicultural, divinely ordained destiny. You could be a proud Gaul and a proud Roman citizen with all the legal and economic benefits that came with it. A similar, though spiritually distinct, strategy was employed by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in ancient India. After a particularly bloody conquest of the Kalinga region, Ashoka experienced a profound transformation, renouncing violence and embracing Buddhism. But his turn to peace did not mean an end to his imperial ambitions. It meant a change in his methods of unification. Ashoka became a master of what we might call narrative governance, using the moral and philosophical tenets of Buddhism to craft a new, unifying identity for his vast and diverse empire. He did not force conversion. Instead, he had his edicts carved into stone pillars and rock faces across the subcontinent promote the Buddhist values of compassion, respect for all life, non-violence, and religious tolerance. He framed his own rule not through a myth of divine birth, but through the narrative of a compassionate, paternalistic king who was responsible for the moral welfare of all his subjects, whom he referred to as his children. This created a powerful shared ethical framework that could appeal to people of various faiths and backgrounds. By promoting Dharma, a concept of universal law and righteous conduct, he provided a common moral language that could transcend local loyalties. His narrative was one of benevolent conquest, where the empire's goal was not to plunder but to improve the lives of its people through ethical rule and public works. This story of compassionate governance helped to unify a fractious subcontinent, reducing the desire for rebellion by presenting the emperor not as a distant oppressor, but as a caring father figure working for the common good. The genius of these strategies lay in their ability to reduce the immense administrative and military burden of empire. It is incredibly expensive and logistically daunting to station legions in every single village to crush every hint of dissent. It is far cheaper and more effective to co-opt the existing local power structures, the chieftains, the priests, the landowners, by offering them a prestigious place within the imperial system. When a local elite family's son could grow up to become a Roman senator, or a regional governor could earn the respect of the emperor for promoting Dharma, their loyalty was effectively purchased with status and opportunity, not just coins. They became the empire's most effective advocates on the ground, translating its myths into local contexts and ensuring stability from within. This transformed the very nature of resistance. Why would a Gallic nobleman rebel against Rome when his family enjoys the legal protections of citizenship and trades freely across the empire? Why would a merchant in Ashoka's realm object to a ruler who built roads, dug wells, and promoted peaceful commerce? Examining this phase of empire building reveals a critical truth. Myths were not just for the glorious beginning. They were absolutely essential for the tedious, unglamorous work of maintenance. The initial conquest might be achieved with the sword, but long-term control was secured with the story. A powerful, inclusive narrative could do what no army ever could. It could convince people that their best future lay within the empire, not outside of it. It could turn the reality of conquest into a story of opportunity, and the fact of foreign rule into a tale of shared destiny. By making people stakeholders in the imperial story, these ancient empires built a foundation of legitimacy that was far more resilient and far less costly than any wall, creating civilizations that would echo through history long after their armies had turned to dust. The strategies perfected by pharaohs and emperors are far from relics of a distant past. They are living blueprints that continue to shape the world stage, echoing through modern political rhetoric with an uncanny familiarity. The core mechanisms of mythic justification never truly vanished. They simply traded the trappings of ancient deities for the language of nationalism, ideology, and progress. Modern nations, much like their ancient predecessors, rely on foundational stories to legitimize everything from territorial expansion and foreign intervention to sweeping domestic policies, tapping into the same deep-seated human needs for identity and purpose that the rulers of Rome and Tenochtitlan so expertly manipulated. Consider the 19th century American doctrine of manifest destiny, a phrase that perfectly encapsulates the ancient concept of a divine mandate. This wasn't a detailed political policy, it was a powerful narrative. It held that white Americans were a chosen people, endowed by Providence with a virtuous and inevitable mission to spread their form of civilization and democracy across the entire North American continent. This belief transformed a brutal campaign of displacement and conquest against Native American nations into a righteous, even holy endeavor. The land wasn't being stolen, it was being fulfilled. This narrative provided a moral absolution for actions that might otherwise have been condemned, mirroring exactly how Roman emperors used the story of Aeneid to frame their conquests as a benevolent civilizing mission fated by the gods. The psychological effect was identical. It allowed a soldier on the western frontier or a settler carving a farm from ancestral lands to see themselves not as aggressors but as instruments of a grand, historical, and divinely sanctioned purpose. Across the globe and into the 20th century, the Soviet Union crafted its own potent secular mythos to justify its authority and expansion. The state-sanctioned narrative of spreading world communism was a direct parallel to the idea of a chosen people with a sacred duty. The Soviet vanguard, the Communist Party, was portrayed not just as a political group but as the inevitable engine of history, chosen by the scientific laws of Marxism-Leninism to liberate the oppressed masses of the world. This was a divine mandate stripped of its supernatural elements but identical in its function. Intervention in Eastern Europe, support for revolutions in Africa and Asia, and the harsh suppression of internal dissent were all framed as necessary steps in fulfilling this predestined historical victory. The language was different, speaking of dialectical materialism instead of the will of Jupiter, but the underlying structure was the same as the ancient myths, a story of cosmic inevitability used to justify control and conquest. Even today, in our seemingly disenchanted and information-saturated age, these ancient patterns persist with remarkable force. Political leaders routinely invoke national myths to rally public support for military action. A call to defend the homeland or to spread freedom and democracy taps into a well of pre-existing stories about national identity and virtue, often framing complex geopolitical conflicts in the stark, moral terms of a chosen people confronting an existential threat or chaos. Domestically, policies are regularly justified by appealing to a nation's founding legends, its revolutionary struggles, its constitutional ideals, or its pioneer spirit. These appeals are powerful because they connect present-day political debates to a deeper, emotionally resonant narrative of identity, making opposition to a policy feel like a betrayal of the nation's very soul and purpose. Recognizing these continuities is not an academic exercise. It is a critical skill for modern citizenship. When we understand that a political message is employing the same mythic structures used to justify the expansion of the Roman Empire or the Aztec demand for sacrificial victims, we gain the power to deconstruct it. We can learn to ask crucial questions. Who benefits from this narrative? What alternative stories are being suppressed or ignored? How is this simplifying a complex reality into a familiar archetype of heroes and villains? By pulling back the curtain on these techniques, we can see the difference between a reasoned argument for a policy and a mythic appeal designed to bypass critical thought and trigger emotional allegiance. This historical awareness ultimately fosters a more discerning and ethical public discourse. It allows us to appreciate the power of shared stories to create social cohesion without blindly accepting every story we are told. We can celebrate a nation's founding ideals while critically examining when those ideals are being used as a cover for less noble ambitions. The lesson from the ancient world is not that all myths are lies, but that they are tools that can build inclusive societies or justify terrible oppression. By learning from the past, we become better equipped to choose which stories we will believe in and which we will question, ensuring that the powerful human need for a unifying story serves to uplift rather than to deceive and dominate. Yet for all their power to shape history, the grand narratives of ancient conquest often obscure a far more complex and fascinating reality. We've seen how myths were weaponized to justify empire, but it's equally crucial to separate these carefully crafted stories from the historical truths they often bury. Many of our most enduring beliefs about the ancient world are themselves modern myths, oversimplifications born from taking ancient propaganda at face value. Consider the legendary Trojan War, immortalized by Homer. For centuries, it was considered pure poetic fiction, a thrilling tale of heroes and gods with no basis in fact. Then, in the late 19th century, the amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann discovered the ruins of an ancient city at Hisarlik in Turkey, a site that closely matched the geographical descriptions of Troy. He even unearthed a cache of gold he dramatically dubbed Priam's treasure. This discovery seemed to validate the myth, suggesting a great war had indeed been fought over the famed city. But the archaeological reality is far messier and more interesting than the myth. The site reveals not one city, but multiple layers of settlement built atop one another over millennia. Evidence shows that one of these layers, known as Troy 7, was destroyed by a massive fire and violence around the time the war was supposed to have occurred. However, there are no inscriptions naming Agamemnon or Achilles, no clear evidence of a united Greek army. Instead, the clues point toward something more mundane yet strategically logical. Troy was a wealthy city perfectly positioned to control vital trade routes through the Dardanelles. Its destruction was likely the result of economic rivalry and a brutal struggle for control over lucrative maritime commerce, not the abduction of a single queen. The myth of Helen provided a romantic, personal cause for a war that was almost certainly driven by greed, resource competition, and political ambition, a pattern we see repeated throughout history once we scrape away the legendary veneer. This process of demystification is equally vital when examining the Aztec Empire and its practice of human sacrifice. The dominant narrative, heavily influenced by Spanish conquistador accounts who had every reason to portray the Aztecs as monstrous fanatics, focuses almost exclusively on the religious fanaticism behind the ritual. The image is of a blood-soaked priesthood blindly feeding hearts to a hungry sun god out of sheer zealotry. While the religious belief was undoubtedly sincere and the scale of sacrifice was vast, to attribute it solely to fanaticism is a profound oversimplification that ignores its sophisticated political and psychological functions. Modern scholars now understand that sacrifice was the terrifying centerpiece of a comprehensive system of state terror and diplomatic control. The flowery wars, those ritualized battles with neighboring states like Tlaxcala, served as a constant source of captives for the altars. This practice was not just about appeasing the gods, it was a brutal form of psychological warfare that kept rival cities in a state of fearful submission. The constant specter of being chosen for sacrifice hung over enemy nations, making them far less likely to organize a unified rebellion. Furthermore, these rituals were public spectacles of overwhelming power, designed to awe the Aztecs' own population and the ambassadors from subject states who were forced to witness them. The message was unmistakable: resist the empire, and this will be your fate. The practice also had a grim economic dimension, as the constant warfare and sacrifice helped the Aztec elite control the distribution of prestigious military honors and maintain a warrior class whose loyalty was ensured by a never-ending demand for captives. To reduce this complex system to simple fanaticism is to miss the cold, calculating pragmatism that underpinned it, a strategy of control as deliberate as any Roman law or Egyptian monument. This pattern of simplification extends to our very understanding of how conquests were achieved. The myths we inherit almost universally celebrate the lone, brilliant hero, the Alexander, the Caesar, the legendary founder who single-handedly changes the course of history through sheer force of will and martial genius. This makes for a compelling story, but it's a dramatic distortion of historical reality. No conquest, no matter how charismatic the leader, was ever a solo endeavor. These great figures were always the apex of a vast and collaborative support system. Alexander the Great did not conquer the Persian Empire alone. He did it with the most advanced military technology of his day, the Sarissa pikes of his infantry phalanx, and a sophisticated logistics network that kept his army supplied across thousands of miles. He relied on brilliant engineers to siege cities, diplomats to negotiate surrenders, and historians to record his deeds for propaganda purposes. Similarly, the expansion of Rome was not the work of a few great generals, but a relentless machine powered by institutionalized discipline, superior road-building technology, and a pragmatic policy of offering citizenship to conquered peoples, which incentivized assimilation and created a massive pool of loyal manpower. The myth of the solo hero serves a specific purpose. It personalizes power, making complex historical processes easier to digest and remember, but in doing so, it erases the contributions of thousands of unnamed soldiers, administrators, traders, and engineers whose collective effort truly built the empire. Debunking these ancient misconceptions is far more than an academic exercise. It is an essential tool for cultivating a critical mindset in the present. By understanding how ancient elites used simplified, glamorized, or outright fabricated stories to legitimize their power, we gain a lens through which to examine the narratives we are fed today. The same techniques are alive and well in modern political propaganda, advertising, and media. When we recognize a story that glorifies a lone leader while ignoring systemic contributors, or a narrative that frames complex geopolitical conflict in the simplistic terms of good versus evil, we are seeing the ancient playbook in action. This critical approach empowers us to peel back the layers of modern myths, to ask what economic pressures, political pragmatism, or social factors are being obscured by a sensational story. It encourages us to seek evidence-based understanding, to look for the complex, collaborative, and often messy realities that lie beneath the surface of any neatly packaged tale of destiny, heroism, or fanaticism. In separating the myth from the reality of the past, we arm ourselves with the skepticism needed to navigate the stories of the present. This journey through the ancient world leaves us with a pressing and profoundly modern question. If the power of story is so easily twisted to serve the ambitions of the powerful, what is our ethical responsibility as the audiences of today? The pharaohs, emperors, and kings we've discussed were master architects of belief, but their legacy is a double-edged sword. It demonstrates the incredible beauty of stories to unite and give meaning to human experience, while simultaneously revealing their terrifying potential to be weaponized, to normalize the unacceptable, and to make atrocity feel like piety. This isn't just a historical observation. It's a cautionary tale that speaks directly to our current moment, an era defined by information overload, algorithmic persuasion, and competing narratives vying for our allegiance. At the heart of this ethical dilemma is the vulnerability inherent in our own psychology. We are, as a species, hardwired for narrative. We crave the coherence, the identity, and the sense of purpose that a good story provides. Ancient rulers intuitively exploited this vulnerability, and modern purveyors of influence, whether political, commercial, or ideological, do the very same thing today. They frame complex issues with the simplistic arc of a hero's journey. They identify a clear villain to direct our fear and anger, and they offer a sense of belonging to a chosen-in group fighting for a righteous cause. Recognizing this pattern is the first and most crucial step toward ethical defense. It's about cultivating a healthy skepticism, not toward stories themselves, but toward the intentions behind them. We must learn to ask, whenever we are presented with a compelling narrative, who benefits from me believing this? What actions does this story make me see as normal or necessary? And perhaps most importantly, whose voices are missing from this tale? This is where the ancient practice of critical thinking, championed by philosophers like Socrates, becomes a vital modern survival skill. It's not about cynicism or rejecting all shared beliefs. It's about the disciplined practice of questioning and seeking evidence. In a world where a viral story can spread across the globe in minutes, the ability to pause, to verify, and to consider alternative explanations is a radical act of self-defense. It's the intellectual equivalent of looking behind the grand monument to see the scaffolding and the chisel marks, understanding that every story is constructed by someone for some reason. This skill allows us to appreciate the power of a narrative while resisting its pull to override our individual moral compass. We can admire the epic sweep of the Aeneid while also recognizing it as a brilliant piece of state propaganda designed to consolidate the power of Augustus. Furthermore, the ancient world teaches us that the most potent antidote to a dominant, oppressive myth is the proliferation of diverse voices and counter-narratives. Just as the Jewish story of Exodus challenged the pharaoh's claim to divine right, and indigenous tales reframed Spanish conquistadors as tricksters rather than gods, our modern media ecosystem is strengthened by a multitude of perspectives. This is why protecting journalistic independence, platforming marginalized voices, and encouraging artistic expression are not just liberal ideals. They are essential safeguards against the monopoly of a single, controlling story. A society that only hears one version of events is a society primed for manipulation, just as susceptible to narrative control as any ancient subject who knew only the official myths carved on temple walls. By actively seeking out and listening to stories that challenge our assumptions, we do more than just become informed. We build cognitive resistance against the tools of modern conquest. Ultimately, reflecting on these ancient lessons is a call to collective accountability. It challenges us to strive for a society where stories are used to inspire, to educate, and to connect us to our shared humanity, rather than to deceive, to divide, and to dominate. It asks our leaders, political, corporate, and cultural, to wield the power of narrative with a profound sense of ethical responsibility, understanding that the stories they tell can literally shape reality and have lasting, real-world consequences. And it empowers each of us as individuals to be more conscious consumers of the stories that surround us, to recognize the ancient patterns playing out on our screens, and to choose, critically and conscientiously, which narratives we will allow to guide our actions and define our world. The stories themselves are not the danger, it's our passive consumption of them. The ethical imperative, then, is to move from being an audience to being a participant, armed with history's lessons and the unwavering commitment to question the tale, no matter how grand it may seem. Now let's turn the lens inward and put these ancient insights to work in our own lives. This isn't just an academic exercise, it's a practical toolkit for becoming a more conscious citizen of the modern world. Start by listening for the foundational stories that circulate in your own culture. What are the tales you learned in school about how your nation was founded? What values are held up as absolute and non-negotiable in public discourse? And crucially, who is consistently portrayed as the enemy or the outsider threatening those values? These narratives are the modern equivalent of the myths we've been exploring. They form the bedrock of our collective identity, and they are just as powerful. Next, become a narrative detective and follow the trail of influence. Ask the critical question, who benefits from this particular story being accepted as truth? Does it justify the power of a particular political party, a specific industry, or a social class? Then, investigate the machinery of perpetuation. How is this narrative being reinforced? Is it through repetitive messaging in certain news media, through the curriculum taught in schools, or through powerful national ceremonies and holidays that evoke a specific emotional response? These are the modern equivalents of the priestly recitations and the public festivals of the ancient world, designed to embed the story deep within the cultural psyche. The most revealing part of this process is to actively seek out the counter-narratives, the stories that are being suppressed or marginalized. For every tale of glorious national origin, there is likely an alternative version told by indigenous communities, by descendants of the enslaved, or by those on the losing side of a conflict. Their stories are the modern equivalent of the Jewish Exodus narrative or the indigenous accounts of Conquest, powerful dissenting voices that challenge the official, sanitized version of events. Make a point to listen to them. Read histories written from different perspectives, follow journalists and scholars from outside the mainstream, and pay attention to the voices that are often dismissed or ridiculed. This is how you break the echo chamber. Finally, scan these stories for the ancient patterns we've identified. Listen for the echoes of a divine mandate, whether it's a claim that your nation is exceptional and has a God-given role to lead the world. Be wary of the concept of a chosen people, the idea that your culture is inherently more virtuous, hardworking, or intelligent than others, and scrutinize any rhetoric of predestined victory, the unshakable belief that your side is inevitably destined to triumph because history is on your side, a notion that can be used to justify any number of aggressive or unethical policies in the present. Recognizing these patterns is like gaining a superpower. It allows you to see the underlying architecture of persuasion and question it. This exercise isn't about cynically rejecting every national story or becoming alienated from your culture. It's about moving from a passive consumer of narratives to an active, critical engager. It's about understanding the power of these tales so that you can decide for yourself which ones to embrace, which to question, and which to rewrite for a more inclusive and truthful future. We are all living inside stories that were written long before we were born. The goal is not to escape them, but to understand their grip and, in understanding, perhaps loosen it just enough to choose our own path forward. We would genuinely love to hear what you discover in the comments below. What stories shape your world, and what patterns did you find when you started to look a little closer? From the sun-scorched sands of Egypt to the mist-shrouded peaks of the Andes, we have journeyed across continents and millennia to uncover one of history's most enduring truths, that the stories a culture tells about its origins are far more than simple folklore. They are among the most potent tools ever devised for the exercise of power, masterfully blending raw imagination with unquestioned authority to shape the very destiny of humanity. We have seen how these mythic narratives were meticulously crafted in the halls of priests and the courts of kings, not as mere entertainment, but as strategic instruments to legitimize expansion, cement control, and forge unbreakable bonds of identity among diverse peoples. These tales were then propagated with breathtaking efficiency through stone and song, through ritual and law, embedding themselves so deeply into the collective psyche that they became an accepted reality, a lens through which the world was understood, and a justification for actions that might otherwise seem unthinkable. Yet we have also witnessed the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of this narrative onslaught. From the whispered counter-stories of Hebrew slaves in Egypt to the defiant indigenous myths that reframed Spanish conquerors as mere tricksters, we have seen that the official story is never the only story. Resistance persists often in the quiet corners of culture, preserving alternative truths and keeping alive the hope for a different future. This reveals a universal pattern in the eternal interplay of power and belief, a dance between the overwhelming force of state-sponsored narrative and the stubborn, enduring spark of individual and collective critical thought. This pattern is not confined to the ancient world. It is the very same dynamic we navigate today in our modern era of information overload and sophisticated narrative warfare. The lessons from these ancient civilizations are not relics to be studied and shelved. They are a vital mirror held up to our own time, a crucial lens through which to examine the stories that swirl around us in the digital age. We are constantly bombarded with narratives from politicians, media outlets, corporations, and social movements, each vying for our belief and allegiance. These modern myths often employ the same ancient archetypes: the chosen people, the divine mandate, the inevitable victory, the external threat that must be vanquished. They tap into the same deep-seated psychological needs for belonging and purpose, and they can be wielded with the same potential for both unity and oppression. This historical awareness arms us with an essential skepticism. It reminds us to pause and question the tales we are told, to peel back the layers of emotional appeal and ask who benefits from a particular narrative, what actions it makes seem normal, and whose voices are being silenced or excluded. Remember, the history of every great empire was ultimately written by the victors, polished and sanitized for posterity. But as we have learned, that tale is not the final word. It can be challenged, it can be nuanced, and it can be rewritten by the critical-minded, by those who dare to look deeper, to seek out the suppressed voices, and to understand that the most powerful stories are often the ones we choose to believe for ourselves. Thank you for joining this exploration into the heart of history's most influential legends. May it inspire you to listen more carefully to the stories that shape our world, to recognize the ancient patterns playing out in modern guise, and to never stop seeking the profound and often surprising truths that lie behind them.